The Atheist Who Met God. In this powerful and transformative story, we follow Dr. Jonathan Weber, a well-known atheist professor who spent much of his life dismissing religion and the existence of God. Highly respected for his intellectual prowess, he saw faith as something for the weak-minded. But everything changed when he experienced a life-altering encounter with God that challenged everything he believed. As Dr. Weber wrestles with doubt, personal loss, and unexpected miracles, he finds himself drawn into a deep and personal journey of faith. Along the way, he meets Sarah, a woman whose unwavering belief in God sparks a transformation in his heart. Through their conversations and his own inner struggles, Dr. Weber is led to rethink the very foundations of his life and the truth of the gospel. This story is a testimony to the power of God's love, the depth of faith, and the possibility of redemption, even for those who seem farthest from belief.
Today's story is called The Atheist Who Met God. Enjoy listening.
Dr. Jonathan Weber had spent most of his life standing firmly on the side of reason. As a philosophy professor at a prestigious university, he was known for his brilliant mind and unshakable belief in atheism. His lectures were filled with sharp critiques of religion, especially Christianity. He often referred to faith as a crutch for the weak, a relic of mankind's need to explain the unexplainable. To him, the universe was a cold, indifferent place governed by logic, science, and natural law. But then, one Tuesday afternoon, something happened that would shake his worldview to the core. It started as an ordinary day, but in retrospect, Dr. Weber could see the signs. He just hadn't known how to read them then. It was during his office hours, with his regular students trickling in and out, that he met her.
Her name was Sarah Collins, and she was nothing like the people Dr. Weber usually crossed paths with. She wasn't a student in his class, but she had come to the university to attend a seminar on world religions. Sarah, a devout Christian, had spent years volunteering at local shelters, helping people who had nothing to their names. Her belief in God was as natural to her as breathing. To her, faith wasn't just a concept to be discussed in theory. It was a living, breathing part of her life. Sarah didn't immediately confront Dr. Weber with his atheism. She didn't feel the need to convert him, but she couldn't help but notice how often his lectures, though intellectually stimulating, seemed to lack something. They were sharp but cold, brilliant but detached. She felt that in all his intellectual brilliance there was a hollowness, a missing piece. Their first real conversation came when Sarah stopped by his office to ask about a philosophy paper she was writing. What began as a casual discussion about ethics turned into something much deeper. They found themselves talking about faith, the meaning of life, and the nature of human suffering. Sarah spoke from her heart, sharing stories of people she had helped, the way her faith had been a source of strength through difficult times. Dr. Weber listened, skeptical but intrigued. He had heard many arguments for faith before, but there was something different about Sarah. She wasn't trying to argue with him. She wasn't even trying to convince him. She simply spoke as if her belief in God was a part of who she was, not a theory to be proven. Her words, simple and unpretentious, had a weight to them that he couldn't ignore.
Dr. Weber had always believed that emotions were an unreliable foundation for truth. He would argue that they cloud judgment, that they lead people astray. Yet, when he heard Sarah speak, something inside him stirred, something he couldn't quite explain. He pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to his natural curiosity. After all, he was a philosopher, trained to entertain ideas without letting them cloud his judgment. But the more he spoke with Sarah, the more his certainty began to waver. It wasn't so much her arguments that shook him, it was the way she lived her life. The way she genuinely cared about people, the way she radiated peace and joy, even in the face of hardship. Her faith didn't come across as something theoretical, it was a lived reality. And try as he might, Dr. Weber couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply authentic about it. One evening, as he was walking home after a particularly challenging lecture, he found himself thinking about Sarah and her unwavering belief. And for the first time in his life, he found himself wondering, what if she was right?
That night, Sarah prayed for Dr. Weber. She didn't know why, but as she sat down to pray, his face kept coming to her mind. She prayed for him to experience the same peace and joy that she had found in Christ. She asked God to open his heart, to reveal himself to him in a way that no argument, no intellectual debate could. Little did she know that God was already at work. Dr. Weber didn't know how to articulate what was happening inside him. He tried to drown out the stirring in his heart with logic, with more books, more facts. He spent hours in the library, reading the works of other famous philosophers who had wrestled with the question of God's existence. But the more he read, the more the questions gnawed at him. How could everything have come from nothing? Was the universe really just an accident of physics and chance? Or was there something, or someone, behind it all? His mind raced, trying to find answers. And then one evening, as he was walking back to his apartment, something happened that would change everything.
It was a night like any other. The city was quiet, and the chill of late fall hung in the air. Dr. Weber was lost in thought, thinking about the lecture he had just given and the strange conversation he'd had with Sarah earlier that day. He barely noticed the man sitting on the bench near the entrance to his apartment building. But as he passed, the man called out to him, "Excuse me, sir. Could you help me?" The voice was raspy, weathered. Dr. Weber stopped, annoyed. He wasn't in the mood to help a homeless person, not tonight. But something in the man's voice made him pause. The man was old, his clothes torn, his face lined with age and hardship. Dr. Weber could see the emptiness in his eyes, the kind of emptiness he had studied in his philosophical texts, but had never really seen in person. The man spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I'm hungry and cold. Could you spare a little something?" Dr. Weber hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, handing them to the man. The man took them, then looked up at Dr. Weber with a gaze that seemed to pierce right through him. "You don't believe in God, do you?" the man asked quietly. Dr. Weber froze. He had never met this man before in his life. How could he know that? He started to reply, but before he could speak, the man added, "God believes in you, you know. Even when you don't believe in him." The words hit Dr. Weber like a punch to the gut. He didn't know why, but something about them resonated deep within him. The man smiled faintly, as if he knew exactly what had just happened, and then, without another word, he stood up and walked away.
That night, Dr. Weber lay awake in his bed, unable to shake the encounter. The words of the homeless man echoed in his mind. God believes in you even when you don't believe in him. It didn't make sense, yet it felt undeniable. Was it just a coincidence? Was it just a random encounter with a strange person? Or had something supernatural happened? The next morning, Dr. Weber found himself in Sarah's office again, though this time he wasn't there to discuss philosophy or ethics. He was there to talk about something far more personal. "Sarah," he began, his voice unsteady. "I need to ask you something. I'm struggling with something. I can't explain it, but I feel like there's something more to all of this. Something more than just science and reason. Can you help me understand it?"
Sarah's face softened, and she leaned forward in her chair, her eyes full of warmth and understanding. "I can't give you all the answers, Jonathan," she said gently. "But I can tell you about the one who has all the answers. He's not just a concept to be debated. He's a person. And he loves you." Dr. Weber wasn't sure what he expected to hear, but it certainly wasn't that. Yet, in that moment, he felt a flicker of hope. Something deep inside him wanted to believe. He just wasn't sure he could.
Over the next few weeks, their conversations deepened. Sarah continued to share her faith, not by force but by example. She prayed for him, not in a way that demanded immediate results, but in a way that made it clear that she trusted God to work in his own time. And slowly, piece by piece, Dr. Weber's walls began to crumble. He found himself reading the Bible, not as an academic text but as a living word. He prayed, hesitantly at first, just to see if God would respond. And to his amazement, he did. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, Dr. Weber sat in his apartment, alone. For the first time in his life, he knelt down beside his couch and whispered a simple prayer. God, if you're real, show me. I'm ready to believe. What happened next was something that Dr. Weber could never have predicted.
The lights flickered, then went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness. Dr. Weber stood, heart racing, and felt a sudden warmth fill the room. He couldn't explain it. He wasn't sure he wanted to. But in that moment, he felt something. Something that could only be described as the presence of God. His eyes filled with tears. For the first time in his life, he knew that God was real.
The next day, Dr. Weber called Sarah. He didn't have the words to describe what had happened, but he knew he had to share it with her. I've met God, Sarah, he said, his voice full of wonder. And I think I believe.
Sarah's reaction was everything Dr. Weber had hoped for, and more. There was no judgment in her voice, no sense of, I told you so. Instead, her response was filled with joy, understanding, and encouragement. Jonathan, that's incredible, she said, her voice soft but full of emotion. God has been waiting for you to come home. I knew He would reveal Himself to you in His time. You just had to be open to it. For the first time in a long while, Dr. Weber felt a deep peace settle in his heart. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from intellectual certainty or logical conclusions. It was a peace that transcended understanding, a peace that could only come from a personal encounter with the divine. But even as his heart soared with this newfound faith, doubts began to creep in. Dr. Weber was a man of reason, after all. How could he reconcile what he had just experienced with the rational, scientific worldview he had spent his life cultivating?
Sarah could sense his internal struggle. It wasn't going to be an easy journey for him. It never was for anyone, especially someone as intellectual and analytical as Dr. Weber. But she also knew that God was patient, and He had a way of gently guiding people along the path even through their doubts. I know this is a big step, Jonathan, she said one evening as they sat together in a quiet cafe sipping their coffee. Faith doesn't always make sense in the way we want it to. But it's not about having all the answers. It's about trusting God even when we don't understand everything. Dr. Weber nodded slowly, still grappling with the complexity of what he was feeling. He had always prided himself on his ability to understand and explain things. Yet now, in this moment, he was learning that faith was about something far more profound. It was about relationship, not logic.
It wasn't long before Dr. Weber began to notice changes in himself. Small at first, but significant. He found himself more patient with his students, more compassionate in his interactions with others. He started to feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the simple things in life, the warmth of a cup of coffee in the morning, the beauty of the sunrise, the sound of laughter in the hallways of the university. It was a new kind of awareness, one that made him feel alive in a way he hadn't known was possible. One afternoon, as he was walking across campus, he saw a group of students gathered near the entrance of the library. They were engaged in a heated debate about the existence of God. As he approached, he overheard one of them saying, "There's no way you can prove God exists. It's all just a matter of blind faith." Dr. Weber stopped in his tracks. For a moment, he was tempted to jump in with his usual intellectual rebuttals, to argue the merits of atheism and logic. But instead, he found himself walking up to the group with a different thought in mind. "You're right," he said calmly, surprising even himself. "You can't prove God's existence in the way you can prove a mathematical equation. But sometimes, proof isn't about logic. Sometimes, it's about experience." The students looked at him, puzzled. Dr. Weber smiled gently. "I spent my whole life arguing against God, thinking I could explain everything with logic and reason. But it wasn't until I experienced God's presence for myself that I truly understood. It's not something that can be explained with words. It's something you have to experience."
That conversation marked a turning point for Dr. Weber. It wasn't about winning the intellectual debate anymore. It was about sharing the truth he had encountered, truth that was far deeper than anything he could have rationalized. And so, as the weeks went by, Dr. Weber began to speak more openly about his faith, not in a way that forced it on others, but in a way that simply shared what God had done in his life. He found that when he spoke from his heart, when he spoke about the peace and joy he had found in Christ, others were drawn to listen. It wasn't a flashy argument or a cleverly constructed point. It was his story, his transformation. But there were still moments of doubt. Times when the weight of his former beliefs would come crashing back. One evening, as he sat alone in his office staring at his computer screen, he found himself suddenly overwhelmed by the question, what if I'm wrong? What if this is just a phase? It was a thought that had plagued him from the very beginning of his journey into faith. What if he was deceiving himself? What if all this, Sarah's unwavering belief, the peace he had found, was just an illusion?
That night, Dr. Weber went for a walk, hoping that the fresh air would clear his mind. As he walked through the quiet streets, he found himself praying again. Not with the carefully constructed words of a philosopher, but with simple honesty. God, I don't know everything. I don't have all the answers. But I know what I've experienced. I know you're real. Please help me, even in my doubt. As if in response to his prayer, Dr. Weber looked up and saw a familiar face. It was the same homeless man he had met weeks earlier, sitting on a bench near the entrance to his apartment building. The man looked up at him and smiled, his eyes gleaming with understanding. "You're still searching, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice calm and knowing. Dr. Weber stood frozen, unsure of what to say. It was as if the man could read his soul. "I don't have all the answers," the man continued, "but I know that God is with you, even in your doubt. He's not afraid of your questions. He's waiting for you to trust him, even when you don't have it all figured out."
Dr. Weber felt a wave of peace wash over him, and for the first time in weeks, he realized something profound. It's okay to doubt. It's okay to not have all the answers. God didn't ask him to have all the answers. He simply asked for his trust. With that realization, the last of Dr. Weber's intellectual barriers began to crumble. He didn't have to have everything figured out. He just had to take the next step, even in the uncertainty. And so, with a newfound sense of peace, Dr. Weber walked home that night, knowing that his journey with God was just beginning.
A few months later, Dr. Weber stood in front of a crowded lecture hall, preparing for his final class of the semester. The students were chatting among themselves, unaware that today's lecture would be unlike any other he had ever given. As he stepped up to the podium, Dr. Weber looked out at the sea of faces, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Today," he began, "we're going to talk about something a little different. It's a topic I never thought I'd discuss in a philosophy class. But I've come to realize that philosophy doesn't just live in the realm of ideas. It's something that's lived, something that's experienced." He paused, feeling the weight of the words he was about to say. This wasn't just a lecture. This was a testimony. For the past several months, I've been on a journey. And that journey has led me to something I never expected, to the discovery of God's presence in my life. I know this might be hard to accept for some of you, but I'm not here to convince you. I'm here to share my story. The room fell silent. For the first time in his life, Dr. Weber didn't feel the need to argue or defend. He simply spoke from the heart.
And so with that, Dr. Weber's journey had come full circle. From the atheist professor who had scoffed at faith to the man who had encountered the living God, he stood before his students not as an expert, but as a witness to the power of God's grace and the truth of the gospel. It was a journey that had been filled with doubt, with struggle, with moments of laughter and moments of tears. But through it all, Dr. Weber had found the one thing he had spent his entire life searching for. The truth that could not be denied, the truth that had changed his life forever. And as he looked out at the faces of his students, he knew that his story was just one of many. He didn't know what their journeys would look like, but he hoped that just maybe, they would find the same peace and hope that he had found in the arms of Christ.
As Dr. Weber stepped down from the podium, Sarah was waiting for him outside the lecture hall. She smiled warmly at him, her eyes shining with pride. "You did great," she said, giving him a quick hug. "I knew you had it in you." Dr. Weber smiled back, feeling a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. "Thank you, Sarah, for everything." She nodded, her gaze softening. God works in ways we can't always see, but He's always there. "I'm so glad you found him." And as they walked down the hallway together, side by side, Dr. Weber knew one thing for certain. His life had been changed forever, and there was no turning back.
As the days turned into weeks, Dr. Weber's life began to transform in ways he never thought possible. The intellectual battles that had once consumed him gave way to a deeper, more personal understanding of faith. He found himself waking up each morning with a renewed sense of purpose, not because of any philosophical arguments or intellectual victories, but because of a relationship with God that was growing stronger each day. Sarah had become more than just a friend to him. She had become a source of spiritual guidance and support. She had walked with him through his doubts and his fears, gently reminding him of God's love and faithfulness. Though their paths had crossed in the most unexpected of ways, Dr. Weber was beginning to understand that there were no coincidences in God's plan. One evening, after a long day of teaching and grading papers, Dr. Weber sat in his favorite chair by the window, looking out at the city below. The streets were quiet, the city lights twinkling like stars in the distance. He hadn't felt this peaceful in years. As he reflected on how far he had come, he realized that this peace was something he had never truly known before. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from an intellectual conclusion or a sense of accomplishment. It was a peace that came from knowing that he was loved, deeply and unconditionally by the Creator of the universe. But even with all the changes in his life, Dr. Weber couldn't shake the feeling that something more was waiting for him. Something beyond the classroom, beyond the academic debates, beyond the lectures and the theories. He felt a stirring in his heart, a sense that God was calling him to take another step.
The very next morning, as he was sipping his coffee and reviewing his lecture notes, Dr. Weber received an email that would change the course of his life once again. It was from the university's administration, and it was an invitation to speak at the upcoming academic conference on philosophy and religion. At first, Dr. Weber hesitated. He had been asked to speak at many conferences in the past, but this invitation felt different. This wasn't just an academic discussion, it was an opportunity to share the very thing that had transformed his life, the thing that had been burning in his heart ever since that first encounter with God, his faith. He knew that he could no longer compartmentalize his faith from his career. It wasn't just something to be discussed in private or confined to personal conversations with friends. It was a part of who he was now, and it was time for him to share that with the world, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. Dr. Weber took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he typed his response. "I would be honored to speak at the conference," he wrote, before adding, "I would like to share a different perspective on the question of God's existence, one that is not purely intellectual, but deeply personal." He clicked send, then leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it.
As the days leading up to the conference passed, Dr. Weber found himself more and more excited about the opportunity to speak. He had been given a platform and he knew that this was his moment to speak from the heart, to share with others the story of how he had gone from being a staunch atheist to a man whose life had been transformed by the love of God. But as the date of the conference drew closer, he couldn't ignore the voice of doubt that still lingered in the back of his mind. What if they laughed at him? What if they ridiculed him for his newfound faith? What if they dismissed him as a fool, someone who had abandoned reason for religion? He confided in Sarah one evening, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I'm not sure I can do this. What if they think I've lost my mind? I mean, I've spent my whole life criticizing religion, and now I'm going to stand in front of all these scholars and say that I believe in God." Sarah listened patiently, her eyes filled with understanding. "Jonathan, you're not alone. You're speaking from your truth, from your experience. And that's the most powerful thing you can share. It's not about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about being honest. And God will use your story in ways you can't even imagine." Her words were a balm to his soul. Slowly but surely, the doubts began to fade, replaced by a deep conviction that he had to share what he had discovered. He wasn't doing it to impress anyone or to prove anything. He was doing it because he couldn't keep the truth to himself any longer.
The day of the conference arrived, and Dr. Weber stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he looked out at the sea of faces in the audience. The room was filled with some of the brightest minds in philosophy and theology. These were the people who had spent their lives debating the existence of God, the nature of truth, and the meaning of life. And now, here he was, a man who had once dismissed it all, standing before them to share his story. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just an academic lecture, it was a testimony, a declaration of what God had done in his life. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "My name is Dr. Jonathan Weber, and I'm here today to talk about something I never thought I'd be discussing in an academic setting: faith." The room was silent as Dr. Weber continued. He shared the story of his life, his years as a devout atheist, his intellectual journey, and the doubts that had plagued him. But he also shared the turning point, the moment when he encountered God's love in a way that transcended reason. He spoke about his conversations with Sarah, the woman whose unwavering belief had challenged him to rethink everything he once held true. "As a philosopher," he said, "I spent my life searching for truth. I thought truth was something to be discovered through logic, reason, and empirical evidence. But what I've learned is that truth isn't just an idea, it's a person. His name is Jesus, and he's changed my life in ways I can't fully explain."
The room was still as if the audience was holding its breath. Dr. Weber's words were a sharp contrast to the intellectual debates that had typically filled the halls of academia. But there was a power in his story, an authenticity that could not be ignored. When he finished speaking, there was a long silence. Dr. Weber felt his heart racing, unsure of how the audience would respond. And then, to his surprise, one of the professors in the front row stood up and began to clap. Slowly, others joined in until the entire room was applauding. It wasn't an applause for the intellectual arguments he had presented. It was an applause for his honesty, his vulnerability, and his courage to speak from the heart.
After the conference, Dr. Weber found himself standing in the hallway, surrounded by a few colleagues who had attended his talk. They were all asking questions that went beyond the usual debates about philosophy and logic. They were asking about his faith, about the personal encounter he had had with God. For the first time, Dr. Weber felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He wasn't just a professor anymore. He was a witness, someone who had experienced God's love firsthand and was now sharing it with others. As he walked back to his office, he felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. His journey was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone. God had been with him every step of the way, and he would continue to guide him on this new path.
Later that evening, as Dr. Weber sat in his apartment, reflecting on the events of the day, his phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Proud of you, Jonathan," the message read. "God is using your story in ways you can't even imagine. Keep trusting him." Dr. Weber smiled as he read the words, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had come so far from the man he once was, the man who had dismissed faith as foolishness. Now he was walking in the light of God's truth, and there was no turning back.
Dr. Weber's journey of faith didn't end at the conference. It was just the beginning. As he continued to teach, to learn, and to grow in his relationship with God, he found that every day was an opportunity to witness to the transformative power of faith. He wasn't just a philosopher anymore. He was a living testimony to the grace of God, and he was determined to share that grace with everyone he encountered. He never forgot the moment when he first met Sarah, the woman whose unwavering belief had challenged him to rethink everything he once held true. And he never forgot the man on the bench, the one who had spoken words of truth that had pierced his soul. Those moments, those encounters, had been part of God's plan to lead him to where he was today. And as he looked forward to the future, Dr. Weber knew that whatever came next, God was with him. And that was all he needed.
Thank you for joining us on the journey of Dr. Jonathan Weber, the atheist who met God. His story is a testament to the power of faith, the power of God's love, and the fact that no one is ever too far gone to be reached by the grace of God. If you're on your own journey of faith, remember that God is with you no matter where you are. And like Dr. Weber, you don't have to have all the answers, just a willingness to trust him. We hope you've been encouraged by this story and that it has reminded you that transformation is possible, no matter where you start. Dr. Weber's life is proof that no one is beyond redemption, and that God's love has the power to change even the hardest hearts.
As you reflect on this story, Think about how it can influence your own life. Dr. Weber's journey reminds us that we don't need all the answers to begin the search for truth. Trusting God in the midst of uncertainty can lead to unexpected discoveries. Whether you're struggling with doubt, facing challenges, or simply seeking meaning, remember that faith is not about having it all figured out. It's about taking the next step with God, knowing He's always with you. Dr. Weber's story also invites us to examine our own lives and how we interact with others who may be on different journeys. Just as Sarah's unwavering faith challenged Dr. Weber, we can be a source of hope and encouragement for those around us. Whether through our words or actions, we are called to share God's love and be open to the opportunities He places before us to be a witness to others. We may never know the impact of a simple conversation or the seeds we plant, but trust that God can work through us in ways that far exceed our understanding. So, as you walk through your own life, take this story with you, that you don't have to have it all figured out to begin your own journey of faith. Don't let doubts or uncertainties hold you back. God is bigger than all of them, and His plan for you is filled with grace, purpose, and unimaginable transformation. Trust Him, step by step, and be open to the ways He will lead you.
That's it for this story. Subscribe so you don't miss out on more inspiring stories in the future.